We now turn to a discussion of the Phil Spector legacy. Remember, Phil Spector is the producer from the first half of the 1960s, producing big hits for girl groups and later for the Righteous Brothers, but really seen as one of the iconic figures and representative figures of that early period. So you would think, given the way the story goes, that when the Beatles come along in February of 1964, Phil Spector is one of the casualties of Beatlemania and the British invasion. His groups would be some of the groups that would be pushed off the charts, and that's an idea you could get from the way the story is usually told. But in fact, Phil Spector continues to have success with his groups at the same time as the Beatles are having success with their groups. If you actually look at the charts, the Crystals' "The Do Ron Ron" was a #3 hit in 1964. Their "Then He Kissed Me" was a #6 hit in '64. The Ronettes' iconic girl group track "Be My Baby" was a #2 hit in 1964, and he continued to have hits into 1965 with the Righteous Brothers' "You've Lost That Loving Feeling" and the Righteous Brothers doing "Ebb Tide," which was a #5 hit still in 1966. So the idea that the British invasion totally shut American artists down or off the charts is a little bit exaggerated. It made a big difference, but it's easy to sort of exaggerate that difference a little bit. Phil Spector has a bit of a legacy in this country. That is, people who came after him who were very much influenced by what he did in the early 60s and sort of pushed the ball a little further down the field in the 60s with American music. Interestingly, for me at least, one of the most significant of these people is Sonny Bono. Sonny Bono, half of the duo Sonny and Cher, had been Phil Spector's promotion guy on the West Coast and his aide. He was around at Gold Star Studios when Phil was recording a lot of those girl group tracks. He ended up singing background or playing tambourine or whatever on some of those tracks. And his girlfriend, Cher, actually sang backup on a lot of those girl group tracks. And so Sonny starts to get the idea, well, he wants to do what Phil's doing. He wants to produce and act. He wants to write his own songs. You know, he wants to pretty much do what Phil's doing. He's been his apprentice, his assistant all this time. So one of the first attempts is a song that responds to the British invasion. It was sung by Cher, but her name was given as Bonnie Jo Mason in 1964, and the name of the song was "Ringo, I Love You." Well, that one didn't do so good, but when the American response started to happen in 1965, Sonny immediately got on the bandwagon of that and had Cher do her own version of "All I Really Want to Do." It was on the charts at the same time as the Byrds' version of that tune. The Byrds, it was their follow-up to Mr. Tambourine Man. But "All I Really Want to Do" got pushed off the charts. The Byrds' version of "All I Want to Do" got pushed off the charts by the Cher version. And there's a story, I don't know whether it's true or not, of Bob Dylan saying to Roger McGuinn, "How could you let this happen?" Right? You let the Cher version knock the Byrds' version off. Of course, for Dylan, it was all the same because, of course, as a songwriter, he gets paid either way. So Sonny, he thinks, well, you know, I can write one of these Dylan songs, and what's the essential elements of this Dylan song? So he starts to to write, and the way he liked to tell the story was, you know, Dylan's always saying this babe, babe, babe thing, you know, it ain't me, babe. So he came up with this tune that went, "I got you, babe," right? And for him, it was his version, sort of like P.F. Sloan had done with the Barry McGuire hit, "Eve of Destruction," of writing what he thought sounded like a Dylan song. "I Got You, Babe" went to #1 in 1965 and made Sonny and Cher real pop stars. They came back with a couple of different hits. Maybe their biggest hit after that was a tune from 1967 called "The Beat Goes On." Sonny and Cher early on, I mean, a lot of folks who grew up with this music certainly grew up in the 70s. Remember Sonny and Cher as being sort of mainstream pop sort of hosts of a variety show that played in the 1970s. But actually in the mid-1960s, they were sort of pioneers in outrageous hippie fashion. Already in 1965 and 1966, they were wearing just crazy clothes. Check it out on the internet. See if you can find some images of this. Way before the hippies really sort of hit with all this stuff in in mainstream American culture anyway. In 1967, you could have gone to Carnaby Street in London and seen some sort of outrageous things, but not like Sonny and Cher. So bad that there were like hotels that wouldn't let them stay there because of the kinds of things they were wearing, this kind of thing. So in many ways, Sonny and Cher, even though they became very mainstream, were edgier in the moment. And Sonny Bono very much at the center of making all that happen. Well, we wouldn't, if we were talking about LA in the 60s, it would certainly be a grand omission if we didn't talk about the Beach Boys and the development of their music, especially along the idea of the legacy of Phil Spector. That Ronettes tune, Be My Baby. Remember, by the time Be My Baby came out in '64, the Beach Boys already had a hit or two. But Brian Wilson wasn't doing the producing at first. There was somebody else, a guy who had been assigned by Capitol Records, their label, who was producing it. And Brian was always thinking, well, I can do this, I can produce this. He really wanted to be like Sonny Bono did, wanted to be just like Phil Spector in the sense that he would have his group, he would write the songs, he would produce them up, just like Phil had done with his famous Wall of Sound kind of thing. He heard Be My Baby, and the way Brian tells the story, he was so impressed by Be My Baby, he listened to, first time he heard it, he was driving the car, he had to stop the car. He was so afraid he was going to have an accident. He had to pull it over the curb and just listen to the tune, and he thought, this is it, this is exactly the kind of, he actually wrote a song that he hoped that the Ronettes would record, but Phil Spector did not record it, and the Beach Boys ended up recording it, but very much influenced by Phil Spector and this idea of using the recording studio to create the biggest and most interesting kind of sound. And so what happens with the Beach Boys is Brian Wilson, who was always a little bit emotionally fragile and maybe a little bit emotionally unstable, has an episode where he doesn't feel like he has an episode where he can't get on a plane, or he has a freak out on a plane. Anyway, the guys decide maybe the best thing to do is to get somebody to replace Brian on the road to do the touring. Brian can stay home, write the songs, work up the arrangements, that kind of thing. When we come back from the road, we'll record up Brian's songs, and then we'll go out and tour them again with somebody else on bass. In fact, one of the first bass player to replace Brian Wilson was Glenn Campbell, who was at that time a session musician doing sessions in LA, who went on to become a big star in his own right. But anyway, Glenn didn't last for very long. Bruce Johnston eventually replaced Brian on the road. A fantastic voice too, so he sang on a lot of the stuff. So Brian stays home, and he's working in the studio, working with Phil Spector's musicians, the top flight musicians in LA who are called the Wrecking Crew. He's got them, he's working on these arrangements, and Beach Boys arrangements get increasingly ambitious. Again, under this idea that that's kind of what Phil Spector was doing in the studio too. So if you think about tracks like California Girls, which is kind of a familiar surf kind of tune, but now with new kinds of sophistication in terms of the instrumentation and the big introduction that occurs and the various kinds of things that happen, you can see that surf music is really starting to get ambitious and starting to mature. Well, the real point of arrival for the Beach Boys and for Brian Wilson in many ways is the track is the album Pet Sounds from 1966. Some of the tracks you may know from that album are Sloop John B, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and God Only Knows. In Pet Sounds, Brian Wilson really creates something like a kind of a concept album. It wasn't thought of a concept album at the time. The way he thought of it was he saw the Beatles' Rubber Soul, and he said, you know, there's an album where the Beatles have really put all the songs together, where the sum of the parts is greater than any of the individual pieces. And so he wanted to do that with Pet Sounds, and so he did. But the album is full of all kinds of studio experimentation. Really, in many ways, the guys were a bit frustrated with the other guys in the Beach Boys were a bit frustrated with Brian because he would have things on the recordings that they couldn't do live, and they thought, well, this sounds fantastic in the studio, but Brian, how are we going to perform this stuff? I mean, we got to play this for people. You know, what followed right after Pet Sounds was Good Vibrations. In many ways, they thought that was just impossible. You know, what followed Good Vibrations was an album that was supposed to be called Smile. But we'll talk about that when we talk about the competition between the Beatles and the Beach Boys during the early psychedelic period, getting into the late '66 and 1967. We'll wait for week 7 on that. But I think probably now it's important to point out that the Beach Boys were not only competing with the Beatles on the charts, but they were competing with the Beatles on their own label. The Beatles in this country were on Capitol Records, and the Beach Boys were on Capitol Records. And the Beach Boys had been on Capitol Records before the Beatles came along, during that period when Capitol wouldn't release any Beatles music. And so along come the Beatles, and the Beach Boys have not just got to fight for the attention of the fans, but they've got to fight for the attention of their own record company. Interestingly enough, the Kingston Trio was also on Capitol at the same time. So a real cluster of important figures are coming together. Some of the other LA acts that is probably worth mentioning and thinking about, Gary Lewis and the Playboys. This group, fronted by a young guy, Gary Lewis, who was the son of popular comedian Jerry Lewis. In many ways, this is a replay of the story that we told about Ricky Nelson, in the sense that, remember when we talked about Ricky Nelson, we said that his dad was Ozzie Nelson. Of course, Ozzie Nelson was very hooked up inside the business and was able to help make it so that Ricky Nelson could have a singing career. Same thing with Gary Lewis. His dad, Jerry Lewis, in the 60s was, one of those kind of guys in Hollywood who was very hot and very much sort of wired inside the business and all that kind of thing. So he was able to help his son quite a bit. The tune "This Diamond Ring" was a #1 hit for Gary Lewis and the Playboys in 1965. "She's Just My Style," a number 3 hit for them in 1965. Another guy coming out of LA, Johnny Rivers, had a couple of hits. Interestingly, his first big album was a live album. We'll see this. It turns out at the end of the 70s where a couple of big acts really sort of break big on the scene because of live albums. The most important being Frampton Comes Alive, right? And Peter Frampton had a number of albums out before Frampton Comes Alive. But here, Johnny Rivers has got an album, Live at the Whiskey. And his first couple of hits are covers of Chuck Berry tunes. So Memphis from 1964, Maybelline from 1964. But probably Johnny Rivers will always be remembered for his version of the song "Secret Agent Man," which got to #3 in 1966 and has become one of those evergreen kind of songs that plays on oldie stations and classic rock stations now all the time. So that concludes our consideration of Los Angeles and the Phil Spector legacy. Let's see what was happening back east on the East Coast during these same years.